Hello everyone. So for this next module, and as we near the end of the term, we are going to continue on our discussion of creative ways to approach qualitative research, building on the idea of arts-based research to talk about this newish concept and term called research creation. And this is something that I'm going to unpack a little bit in this lecture, and also that we'll explore through a guest lecture when we do our next Zoom session on Monday, in which colleagues of mine from the Making with Place project, which I've been speaking about throughout the term, semester, are going to join us, and you also have some material posted on eClass, which you're required to view for this week, and which is featured in your quizzed questions that pertain directly to the project and show you some pieces created by the project. So I'm going to use the Making with Place project to describe research creation, and then you'll have a chance to work directly via Zoom with a couple of the artists involved in the project. So this idea of research creation is really, again, building on the idea of arts-based research, but actually really centering the concept of creation and creating as a form of research. So the idea that multifaceted processes of artistic practice are inherently embodied forms of research. And so we saw last week the idea of art as a tool for data collection, arts or creative sort of based ideas as tools for data dissemination. But research creation is actually kind of taking a step back in even a more holistic way and thinking about the process of creating as being an actual inherent form of research, and how we can think about qualitative research methods being informed by the idea of creation and the concept of research and creation being a sort of combined kind of idea that we can generate to think about how we build this idea of practice and theory and practice. So we talk often about learning from practice to inform theory, and then going back to the practice to build theory. And one way that we do this is in these embodied forms of arts-based practice. And I think you'll see this when our guests, Phyllis and Bert, discuss their learnings and concepts and experiences of research creation. So we have a reading from this week that talks about various different types of research creation to kind of unpack this a little bit further. And this is the Owen and Sawchuk reading. And so we have research for creation, which is the idea that any creative pursuit involves gathering ideas, materials, concepts, collaborators before engaging in that work. So often you might do a review of literature or a review of artistic practice in relation to the creative ideas that are coming up. One might be prototyping or iterating as a way of doing research to build a creative practice. Or one might be doing something around participatory design, or sort of coming together, bringing collaborators together and exploring ideas that are going to be used for creation. So, anytime that we're doing something creative, there's a research element involved in building the approach to that creation. And it could be very arts-based, it might use more traditional forms of research, but this is the idea of research for creation. And then we have this idea of research from creation. So this is performances, interactive works, other kinds of potentially fiction or poetry that is used as a way of generating research data. So we do the artwork and then share it with users potentially, and then get research on different dynamics of how the artwork is experienced, and how the audience, what the audience takes away from it. If this is a participatory visual methods like we were talking about last week, then it might be about exploring, like we did with the photos, exploring what the artist is saying, but also what we see in that art that might be similar or might be broader or might be related to our own lived experiences. So this is the idea of a piece of creation generating research responses. And then we have the idea of creative presentations of research, which we also looked at a little bit last week, or one way of thinking about these things, which is that we have traditional academic research, but we can present it in a creative fashion. You had a video that described different ways of doing this. So we might use traditional methods to gather the research, whether it's interviews or focus groups or things of that nature. But then we create, and you saw some examples of this last week, things like theater or poetry, to translate that research, to get the themes and codes and ideas that have come out of the research out into a dialogue and a discourse. So this is presenting the research using more creative ways of communicating what is coming out of the research or the theories that are emerging. And then finally, we have creation as research. And this is kind of where research creation provides a bit of a new lens. I just mentioned that some of these other forms are things that we've seen before, or different ways of looking at things that we've seen before in arts-based research. But creation as research is kind of also sort of posing that that creation projects can be in and of themselves their own form of research. So this is in some ways the most broadest term that is being proposed by these authors, which again are Chapman and Sawchuk. So this is a reading that unpacks many of these ideas. And the idea is that, as we're involved in creative production, we're developing ideas that are research and that are also are culminating the expression of the research process. So again, this idea that artistic production is research, and it's reimagining or revisiting ideas in a search kind of way. And I think that Phyllis Novak in particular is going to speak to this when we have them as a guest next Monday. So this is an interesting way about thinking about the things that we've been talking about all semester around how knowledge is produced, how knowledge is taken up and reproduced in different contexts through different experiences, how we build bodies of knowledge, and the ways that creative expressions, creative productions, creative practice is part of those processes. One of the interesting things that I've come to be in discourse about through the exposure to these ideas is this idea of defining creation. And you have another reading this week by Fisher, who's actually a faculty member here at York, and someone that you might know or might want to get to know if you're interested in these ideas. And this kind of unpacks something that I think is also probably going to come up from our guests, with this idea that there's an irony around here, that by defining these processes, we're actually sometimes reducing them. So we want to remain as open and as pluralistic as possible, but we are also using these ideas in a context that likes to define and constrain and put labels and definitions on things. And by doing so, we actually might even be constraining what Fisher calls the horizon of possibility, even though we're trying to build the horizon of the concept of research. The concept of trying to define or contain the concept of creation in and of itself provides a lot of tension. So this is, again, something that is a little bit different from some of the methods of arts-based research that we saw last week that are actually in many ways trying to use the arts as a vehicle, or perhaps as a process. And research creation wants to kind of question and problematize that, and critically question whether we use these so much as tools, or whether we want to look more organically and holistically about creating. And that might sound a little bit, that's not all that's. It's a very broad idea, let's say, and it's a little bit hard to define. But I really encourage you to engage with the Making with Plays project materials that I've posted, and then when we have our session, our participatory session on Monday, I think that some of these ideas will come out in all of their complexity, but also a little bit more in a tangible way. But I really like what Fisher says about the idea of failure. And so exploring things from a really critical making perspective. So it's the process of making, not necessarily the products, even though the products inform all of these ideas that we're exploring when we're thinking about research creation. And this idea of failure is beautiful, is generative, and the starting point for what Fisher says, starting point for most of the good things in life. So I think this idea of problematizing the concepts of creation, and even problematizing the idea of using art as a tool, and that art is not and shouldn't be seen solely as a tool, and that that's a little bit reductionist, and that we want to think about it as a really, really holistic and broad process with a lot of different ways of inquiring and problematizing and critical thinking, critical making. And so, these are the concepts that come up when folks are kind of going beyond the idea of arts-based research towards the idea of research and creating as being two parts of the same kind of concept, that there is always research in creation, and perhaps there's always some level of creation or creating in research. I'm going to ask you and leave you with these ideas to then explore the pieces of the Making with Place project, which I've posted. I'm actually not going to do a super long video lecture this week because I want you to spend time with those materials, and I really want you to engage with those examples so that we can have a productive session next week, and so that you can see through your own experiences of those arts works and the descriptions of them, how you take up these ideas or how they come to you or what they mean to you. So Making This Place, which I have spoken about several times throughout the semester, is a community-based research creation project. It is involving artists who are from an agency called Sketch Working Arts, and also myself, who as a student from York, and Phyllis Novak, who's kind of from both places. So Phyllis is the artistic director at Sketch Working Arts, and Phyllis is also a student in the Faculty of Environmental Studies and Urban Change. We have two research mentors who guide our work, which is Lisa Myers and Sarah Flicker. Some of you may have taken courses with either one of these very strong and wonderful mentors that have helped us with this work. And as I've mentioned, Sarah is the person who usually teaches this course on qualitative research methods, and I'm sort of taking the reins this semester for Sarah. And so we've worked with a number of artist researchers from the Sketch Agency who are young people who self-identify as coming from communities who have experienced oppression, either past or current experiences related to locations of Black, Indigenous, poverty, queer, transgender, other kinds of locations that folks have self-identified with, and experiences with the broader systems of oppression and personal experience that relate to these locations. And so Making with Place as this concept of creation as research is really about working with folks to build and share knowledges through arts practice and production. So locating action in the process of creating art from a concept of art as a communal process. So this idea of community arts, which I think I've mentioned before, and prioritizing the voices of young people who do have these lived experiences, to understand their desires and their intentions for three things that we have broadly defined within our research: community, culture, and place. And this idea of place and place showing up in research and showing up in production is a central inquiry point. The idea is, and the work has been, that we have come together as artist researchers to create together and then to investigate the process of creating as a process of research. And we'll show you and talk to you a little bit about that when we engage in the Zoom session on Monday. And our guiding research question really is: how can community arts approaches engage and empower young people through the concept of heal, create, and lead to build more vibrant and inclusive communities? And the idea of heal, create, and lead comes from Sketch's theory of change. It comes from Sketch as an agency, as a community agency, centering their work on using the arts to build these vibrant communities with voices of people who they feel have important leadership and knowledge in building more inclusive and vibrant communities. And so we came together in a process which was mediated by technology at first, because we were constrained by the pandemic, as we all have been in this past year. And then we actually were able to create some socially distant public art projects in the summer of last year. And here's a list of some of the various things that we did do as our creation as research. So we had one of our artists who had some connections with folks who were living in a Toronto encampment. And as you've probably personally witnessed, even as a bystander, there has been an outcropping of folks who are underhoused or experiencing houselessness, living in parks in the city during the pandemic. As we know, the pandemic has been differentially impactful, of course, on more vulnerable communities. And so we had an artist working with us who had some friends who were living in one of these encampments. And being from an Indigenous background, this artist wanted to offer some Indigenous teachings and some Indigenous medicines, in particular the concept of the medicines, to these spaces. And actually, in particular, really kind of break down the barriers that are sometimes related to these spaces, that the whole insider-outsider piece, and the fact that this is happening in our communities, but we're not often engaging with the people with whom it's happening. So we went into the space, and Olympia offered these medicine mobiles, and you'll see some video footage of this on the materials that I've posted this week. And we actually had a communal discussion, we shared a meal, and we were able to share a lot of learning and a lot of knowledge building with people in that moment, which was really an interesting experience. We also had a couple of our artists create a mural and poetry installation on gender-based violence, and you'll see a clip of that on the materials posted, where there's a spoken piece related to this installation, which covers many of these things, and again brings forward this creation as exploring ideas around colonial and gender-based violence. We also had a photography and poetry installation done by one of our artists, focusing on concept of activism. We had an installation on an elemental study through the practice of Indigenous dyes, so using natural plant-based dyes to create beautiful fabrics, dyed fabrics. And this is also a video. This was Phyllis Novak's work. This is also a video where you'll see a lot of the ideas and creating and the research concepts that came out of that creating. You'll see Phyllis in interview in the materials that I have posted this week. We had a few other things that I'm not providing all of these materials to you. I've only provided a few examples on the e-class, but we had a live performance in Young Dundas Square, which was one of our pieces. There was also a couple of sound projections. Actually, one of these is a video which is by Bert Whitecrow, which you may have watched a few weeks ago. I assigned when we were having the discussion on ways of knowing, but I would like you to watch it again, or watch it if you have anew, to experience Bert's piece, because Bert's piece, which was projected at the Bentway, which is an urban park under the Gardiner Expressway, is also a piece that we're going to be speaking about on Monday, because Bert will be joining us. So please have a look at Bert's work, which is a traditional territory acknowledgement using a personal poetic narrative through video and poetic narrative, which I think is quite powerful. And we also had, I don't have an example of this for you, but we did have also an online zine celebrating the artwork of young people identifying as disabled. Actually, I'll put a link to that. I don't have a posting for that for this week, but I can provide a link to that in the slides for next Monday. But these are the various different creation projects that came out of the work that was done by this group, this Making with Place group. And we use these projects to then engage in a process of investigating what are the ideas, what are the theories, what are the learnings that are coming up through these creative practices. And we will unpack that all a bit further in a teaser format when you hear from Bert and Phyllis and myself next Monday, when we talk about a little bit more about the project. So one thing I really want to emphasize in this concept of this type of research, which really builds on the idea of participatory action research, which again I've mentioned a few times throughout the term, is this idea of reflexivity of power. And so the idea that the lens of this type of work is really about revealing hidden practicings, revealing new ways of knowing, renegotiating old relationships that sometimes research sometimes creates very power over type relationships. So trying to shift these things, and again, playing with this concept of insider outsider, which we've discussed a few times, and breaking down the traditional hierarchies of research, which have led, as we opened the class to talk about, led to some real problematic ways of building knowledge, which of course reflect larger distinctions and larger constructions in broader society. So, knowing that we as researchers and research institutions are constrained or working within the structures of inequitable societies, then how do we use research to break down those things? And again, research creation, similar to other kinds of research that we've been talking about, attempts to do this using creative process as the vehicle for the personal and decentering experiences of power, but also the voice and mobilization of knowledge. And I think that it's also interesting to think about the idea of desire. And I just showed you on the previous slide this concept of desires for and intentions for community, culture, and place. And this contrasts the more deficit-oriented approach that we sometimes see as the dominant approach, we often see as the dominant approach in research, especially research that focuses on things like oppression and marginality. And so there's usually a focus on what is wrong in the picture. But the idea of, especially in a research creation kind of context, is refocusing to a more to a more desired focused frame, or desire focused frame. So I think that's important to keep in mind as well in how this work is conceptualized and taken up and taken on. And so, of course, this all relates to our concepts of ethics, which again have been a grounding part of our discussion for this entire semester. So, one of the key things to think about within research creation and any kind of arts-based research is this idea of who decides. Who decides how the research is framed, how it's recorded, how it's disseminated. Of course, this comes back to the concepts of consent that we've been talking about, and the very important processes of consent that have been central to both the research that you've been doing and to the different examples of research that we've explored, and even to the questions and reflections that folks have had about different methods, whether it be ethnography or participant observation or more interview type kinds of methods. So what happens when we're looking at creation or the visual or certain kinds of creative production as research? Well, again, it's very important in this kind of research to center the participant in participatory, as we have wanted to really emphasize. And usually and centrally and very importantly, ethical processes in this work are done and created in collaboration with participants who are actually leaders. So, when we use the terminology in our project, we talk about artist researchers. We don't talk about subjects, research subjects. Our co-researchers, the young people who've created the art projects on which we're working and learning, are really very much active co-creators of knowledge. They're not subjects. That again is decentering that sort of power imbalance kind of traditional research lens or gaze. But having said that, there are times when us insiders / outsiders, or sometimes more outsiders than insiders, or facilitators, if you want to use that term, do need to provide a wider framing. And so usually this is a discussion, again, going back to concepts of risk that come up in ethical guidelines, and discussions about the very kind of complex nature of risk and how risk is assessed by different people from different lenses and different perspectives. and also the whole do no harm kind of imperative of research, that there are times when we do also have to broker or create a discussion around ethical processes from more contextual perspectives that might come from facilitators. And for example, I was involved in a project that used photography with survivors of domestic violence some years ago, and these were people who were in the acute stages of leaving lived experiences of domestic violence, and they were engaging with an agency that was trying to help people transition out of experiences of domestic violence. So they were very much in an acute moment of what is quite a risky experience, and a risk-oriented experience. And so in that project, we felt it was important that they did get access to a research and a creation-oriented opportunity that was about voice and empowerment, that was about learning about their needs and learning about how practitioners, and in particular this agency, could meet them. But we also wanted to do that in a way that kept them kept them in a context that was not going to increase the risk that they were already in. And so for this, we imposed. We didn't even. We did have impose is a very strong word. We had a very collaborative generating of ethical procedures and ethical guidelines, but it was very important to the agency and the facilitators that that involve no human faces in photos. So even blurring out faces or de-identifying people was felt to be too risky for this project. So in fact, we created guidelines which were welcome to the participants, in which only photos of inanimate objects or natural landscapes or things of that nature that they would sometimes use as metaphors were in the pictures, because we were really just quite concerned about anyone really being identified through this work. And so this is an example of where there's a negotiation, there's a discussion, but there's also kind of like a firm line that relates to risk that folks are taking. And so in these spaces, much like all of qualitative research, we have a principle. We want to develop these guidelines from the agency, from the decentering of power, but we also want to make sure that as institutions, as folks who are convening this research, that we're not creating harm when we're doing it. So there's a lot of ethical principles, and I provided a couple of nice textbooks that you can get virtually through or digitally through the York Library related to arts and qualitative research, and there's chapters on ethics in both of those books that go very in depth into this stuff. If you are going to get into this work, certainly holding space for ethics and exploring and ensuring that there's a real robust reflexive ethical approach and practice and procedures that are in place are very important for this work. So I'm going to wrap up with that, and please do engage with the Making with Place materials so that we can have a really great discussion. I've really been, as I've said several times, I've really been very pleased at how folks have taken the place and the space that we've made on the Zoom sessions to deepen analysis, to bring in thoughtful and critically aware questions. And I think that it would be really great to enact that as we come to the end of the term with Bert and Phyllis, so that we can we can really engage with them and their learning in relation to the Making with Place project, and build some further reflections together. And so I'll just give you a little brief description of Bert and Phyllis so you're ready to greet them on Monday. So Bert is an Anishinaabe, a multidisciplinary artist, and a two-spirited artist as well. And they explore themes of healing, preserving, and practicing ancestral knowledge in their work through a variety of media. And you will also see an example of this in Bert's piece on Acknowledge Place, Honor Spirit. Bert is also a founding member of a collective called Weave and Mend, which is a mixed Indigenous collective that works here in Toronto, working on art making workshops and also concepts of permaculture. So that's something to check out and maybe ask Bert about when we are able to greet them on Monday. And Bert is a student at OCAD University in the Indigenous Visual Cultures program. So I'm very excited that Bert will be joining us on Monday. And Phyllis, as I mentioned, is also joining us. And Phyllis is one of the leaders of the Making with Space research as the artistic director and founder of an agency I've mentioned a few times called Sketch Working Arts. And Sketch is a community arts agency that's been working now for over 20 years in Toronto, focusing on engaging young people who have experiences of marginalization. Initially, their work was quite focused on folks living homeless. They've broadened it out now to folks who identify with current or past experiences of lots of different kinds of inequities. And Phyllis is an exciting and well-practiced artist in community arts. And I think you're going to also enjoy to engage with Phyllis's work. And as I mentioned, there's a video of Phyllis's arts-based practice, her Indigenous dye practice, that's on eClass from the Making with Place project, and you'll get a nice, strong sense of Phyllis and her work from that video. So that is going to be, again, next Monday from 11:30 to 12:30, our usual lecture time. And there are, and as a further way of incentivizing you to watch the materials for Making with Place that are posted this week, some of your quiz questions are based on them. So look, yes, happy viewing of that work. I just wanted to touch base to end off this video lecture to talk a bit about the invitation that I put out last class during our last Zoom session around creating a final session. So we only have 2 sessions left. We have the 29th where we'll have Bert and Phyllis join us, and then we have April 5th, which will be our very last session. And what I would like to do is take up any arts materials or arts-based reflections that folks submit in relation to this invitation that I put out last week. So because I think we might need a little bit of extra time to have a really great discussion, then I am extending that session to 1.5 hours. So we will be meeting at 11 on the 5th, and we'll go to 12:30, which is our usual end time, but we'll start at 11 o'clock. So we'll have an hour and a half on Zoom to really give us time to experience the results of this invitation, which I put out last week. And so this invitation is for folks to engage using arts-based materials during our last class in a couple of different ways. So either to take up this technique of photo voice, which we discussed last week. So submit images that represent your experiences or expressions of activism. So they could be literal images of activism that you feel reflect something related to our research question on activism in environmental studies students that we've been looking at all term, and also or expressions or metaphors related to that activism. So, in general, this idea of photo voice and the idea of the image as a vehicle for inquiry, are there things that you would like to put forward that we could discuss and help us build our knowledge base together around your approaches and your experiences of activism? So that's one way to take up this invitation. The other way is to think about how you might use some of these more creative approaches that we've been discussing to communicate the results of your analysis. So you're all involved in analyzing our class data set, and you're all coming up with really important and key learnings in relation to that data set. And so you've seen some examples in the readings and that I've discussed about how you might communicate some of those results in a little bit more of a creative or compelling arts-based way. And so you might here want to use image. You might want to use the idea of research poetry, which came up last week in one of our readings. There could be other ways that you want to communicate using arts-based work, some of the key themes that you're identifying while you're coding the transcripts for your final assignment. And I will also go back to this question which came up a few weeks ago. what do we want to communicate from these results and to whom? And perhaps there's particular messages that we want the faculty at York University to hear. So perhaps we want certain messages to go to especially to our faculty, the environmental and urban change faculty, because that's going to inform potentially curriculum, potentially how certain student active initiatives are run. And if we're developing this research, we're not just doing it so you all get a sense to practice the research, but we actually would like to communicate some of the key findings if there's some things that we really feel like people outside of the class need to hear. So you can do this, and perhaps one way you would like to do this is to create some kind of arts-based material that then we could communicate to leadership at EUC. And so that's another thing that I think another way that you can take up this invitation for how you might address that question in our last session. If you don't want to do this in a creative way, if you'd rather do it by presenting a concept or an idea, then we may still have space for that. But I'm going to ask you to think about this idea of how you use the arts to communicate, either to use the photo voice to identify your own experiences, or to use arts to communicate the results of your analysis. And we can talk a little bit further during our session on the 5th about where we might want those things to go. So maybe we as a class want to put together a little report or a set of these findings that we want to communicate to the faculty. And Sarah Flicker, who, as I've mentioned a few times, designed this course, is one of the decision makers that we have access to, and was the former vice dean of EUC, and so has lots of relationships that could help us to figure out who we'd like to communicate this stuff to. So let's come together on the 5th as a way of closing off our time together. Let's explore some of these creative ideas, discuss them together. We'll do that over the hour and a half, starting at 11 o'clock. And so what I will ask you to do, if you would like to, by no means is this, of course, a requirement of any sort. It's really an invitation for folks who may have interest in enacting some of these things and maybe feel that they have something to say about these things. And then, of course, the rest of the class will also be able to engage through reflection and dialogue on anything that is submitted that we'll take up during our session. So I will ask you to email me anything you'd like to suggest for this session by 8 p.m. on Sunday, April 4th, and also copy your TA so that they are aware, and we're all aware of what the submissions are that are coming in. And then I think that'll be a really nice way to end off the class. And so this is, again, just to kind of reinforce, this is taking up this idea of researching in particular through visual methods, because I suspect that's going to be the key kinds of material that you submit, although I do encourage things like poetry and other things as well, to really sort of say, how might we express ideas, use these arts-based methods as both methods of inquiry and data collection, but also as methods of dissemination, as I just said, so that we might actually come up with a few pieces of artwork or creative presentation that we want to communicate to the faculty to say, here's something we're learning that we really think you need to know. And of course, for that, coming back to this idea of ethics, we really need to respect the anonymity and confidentiality of the ethics process that we've already created together as a class. So anything that you're communicating regarding the results of your work should not identify your colleagues. You're already working with transcripts that hopefully don't have any kind of identifying names attached. If for some reason you've reviewed transcripts and you can tell who the person is who was interviewed, then please make a strong effort to ensure that that is removed, that anything like that is removed from anything that you're using to communicate your results. And also, of course, we will respect the confidentiality forms that everybody has signed to ensure that during our session, anything that is shared is kept confidential. And I think it's also very important within this concepts that I was just speaking about in terms of protecting folks and engaging in a really important ethical practice, is that you do seek consent from anyone who is in the photos. If you are using the photo voice technique or any kind of visual image, and I would really actually strongly suggest, if it's someone that you have in your immediate circle that you're able to get a really a clear consent from, then perhaps that's okay. But usually, and maybe sort of, the main focus for this for us will be that who's ever in the picture should not be identifiable in any way. So you can blur people out, you can cut folks out of pictures by cropping them, or crop the picture in such a way that they're not identifiable. I think that would be important to ensure that we're practicing, ethical process as we're sharing. If you would like to be in your own images, I think that's fine. You can make that decision by yourself. But for anyone else, I think we should err strongly on the side of ensuring their anonymity. Okay, so I think that's it. Please do engage with the materials that I've posted. I mentioned that I will also provide the link to that online zine from artists who identify as disabled, so that you'll have that as well. So there's several materials that will be on the e-class, and I look forward to your impressions and dialogue with Phyllis and Bert on Monday.